Hi and welcome. This chapter touches one of the most important assets when it comes to air combat, the controller. I have foreseen it to be a rather quick and dirty discussion, fundamentally a list of brevities and concepts. Then I realized that not many players have even heard actual radio comms of a real engagement, whether it be an actual fight or an exercise. Therefore I decided to expand the discussion using actual recordings and footages. Sources, of course, are in the description. We start by spending a few words about the controller itself, and used real recordings from the 1981 Gulf of Sidra, or Sirte, incident compared to a modern recording. I do not have many details about the latter, but I took the comments written in the source video as correct. Next, we have a quick look at the basic formalism and lexicon, including picture, bullseye, BRAA, and other concepts. The discussion about ROE and classification prompts a quick parenthesis about escalation, something I have learned the hard way playing DCS in my very first mission in a jet. For this purpose, I will use a part of the footage of the 1989 Gulf of Sidra incident. Lastly, I have listed a few labeling techniques that should cover the basics, for example lead and trail group, wall, or champagne. Champagne. Probably champagne. The NATO website calls AWACS the eyes in the sky. From a DCS perspective, controllers are more eyes off the sky, as they can be ground-based or airborne. In the game, AWACS are fundamentally everywhere. Introduced in the mid-late 70s, the US Air Force, for example, has 31 modern AWACS available, Russia 16, according to Wikipedia. But on any random DCS server, there is probably a third of them flying at the same time. On the other hand, DCS probably underrepresents the historically most common form of control, which is ground-based, with all its pros and cons such as limited or no mobility, potentially reduced visibility caused by, for example, terrain masking, and so on. Simplifying, the job of the controller, for the purpose of the game, is to provide situational awareness and monitoring of the asset in a defined airspace. This includes non-friendly aircraft, but also neutral or hostile, with everything that runs between them. Other tasks include command and control, guidance, early warning, and so on. The AI controller in DCS is unfortunately poor at best, therefore this discussion assumes that human controllers are present and in sufficient numbers. For example, in one of the last missions I have flown, we had 3 or 4 controllers, each of his area to manage, and with someone dedicated to check-ins, for example, and other tasks. In terms of immersion and effectiveness, the difference is night and day, and I strongly encourage you to find a group that flies with good and capable human controllers. An aspect to take into account is how comms have changed in the last decades. Comparing the audio recording from the first Gulf of Sidra incident in 1981 with the second incident occurring in 1989 with modern recordings is indeed enlightening. Such huge differences in terms of lexicon, pace, precision highlight again how notions change through the years, another reminder of what I mentioned in my disclaimer in chapter 1.
Right now, I'll stay in that cluster. I want to see that contact now. That's 22636. 20 miles from 102. 20,000 feet. 22533, 102. And 102, holding anything that contact. 102's got 1214. He's 16 miles now. That's all I've got. He appears to be turning a little bit left, giving us a left aspect. I'm in single target track. 14 miles, 21,000. 113, see your heading. 070. What's your kill? You're 23024. 10 miles. 102, the bogey's got us on his nose now, 8 miles. Full altitude, we're at 20,000 feet, 6 miles. 103, you're vector 100. 103, state. 6 hitters is shot at my leader. This is 103, we've been fired at. Hitters on the left side, I want to pick guys up. 103. Okay, copy. You copy that, Burners? Negative, what did 106? I'm telling you, Mike, I have he's headed back to the east. Burners, did you just copy 103? That's negative. Okay, they said they've just been fired upon, is what they transmitted. I'm parked out of 6. 102, confirm, said you've been shot up, over. 102, confirm you've been shot at. Affirmative. want me to shoot my guy down? Got the fire, shoot him! Shoot him down. 205, 223, vector inbound this time. 223. Inbound, roger that. Fox 2, kill for music. Fox 2, kill. So you go, that's our hit going. 1028, 106, 8. Fox 2, kill, he's down. He's not before he's falling free. Okay, music, 106, reset camp 5. 106, 110, reset camp 5. Okay, music is at 230 at 123 DME on the 180. And I'm straight, 10-2, 10-2. Okay, I'm 9-5.
107, you are clear to defend yourself.
102, 107, you're clear to defend yourself. Pass from the ship. And this is 102, 107, 2 enemy kills. Say again? 2 enemy kills. 2 MiG-23s kill. Kill 2 at MiG-23s. You copy, boys? All right, that's right here.
Under copy at Station 4, let's check your noise.
Mine was a sitter, a sitter.
107, step here. 107, Marys.
This is 102, go ahead.
You relay for 107. I'd like to find out his, we're 1 or 2 hit.
102 and 107 are fine. We're both headed north. And there are 2,
Roger that, I confirm you've got 2 MiG-23 kills.
okay, one was a sitter, and they're probably both sitters, but there are 2 kills.
One thing should have caught your attention right away. There is a sense of confusion, and a series of very real issues. Clutter, and some comms seems to have been relayed, for example. In general, the formalism is quite open, plain English is often used. The following instead is an excerpt from a video found on YouTube. This appears to be an exercise, and the first noticeable aspect is the formalism. Of course, these are 2 vastly different events. One is an actual fight, and adrenaline is pumping. The other is an exercise, but the key point is that again, different sources provide different information depending on the agency and the era.
One picture. Thing 1, 3 groups. South group, Bullseye, 096, 38, 33,000, letting on thing 2. North group, Bullseye, 069, 48, 2800, 2,800, track west, hostile.
Thing 1.
And third group, cold track.
Thing 2, target South Group 33,000. Babe! Short skate, 40 scope. Crank north. 2 shots! Group E. Crank north out!
Thing 1, North group, BRAA, 061, 18, low.
Thing 1, targeted there, dropping. Thumper, monitor, North Group 3000.
Thumper.
Thing 1 and 2, check by reference 320. Thing 1 and 2, reference 300. Thumper, Thing 1, picture.
Thumper, single group, Bullseye, 050, 36, low, North group.
Thing 2, target group Bullseye 047, 37, 3000. 2. Thing 2, hot right 20 scope. 2. Thing 1, Mike 090, 15, 3000.
Thumper, pop-up group, Bullseye, 095, 58, 32.
Thing 1. Thing 2, bogey node. South group, correction, North group leaning on Thing 1.
Thing 2, group, BRAA, 029, 17, 3000, hostile. Track west.
Thing 2, rock group 032, 34, 3000. Thing 2, press. 2. Status west. Unable shot. Stand by 10 seconds. Thing 2, Fox 2, group Bullseye 022, 30. Thing 2, Sally. Thing 2, Fox 2.
Thumper, new picture. 2 groups, Aspen, 21, North group, Bullseye, 085, 37, 1,300. South group, 22,000, hostile, both groups.
Thing 1, target North group Bullseye 083, 37.
Thing range, 35, North group.
Thing 1, Thing, crank south. Thing 2, hold shots.
Although, as mentioned, the situation is very different with everything that this entails, on top of the fact that the recording from the 1981 Sidra incident does not have intra-cockpit or section comms, the evolution in terms of lexicon and formalism is tangible. This leads again to the key constant of the study: concepts, doctrine, technology, change. If you're new to this is apparent only superficially, but later we will see how the sandbox approach of DCS requires players to draw a line and decide what to use and what not. An example, just to convey the message: the usage of the Bullseye in the modern radio comms is not applicable to the F-14 Tomcat we have in-game at the moment. It would take so much energy and focus from the Rio to do that eventually defeats entirely the purpose. The information provided by the controller varies throughout the mission, depending on the type of control, which should be clarified before the mission, the phase of the flight, and so on. Broadcast, as the name suggests, is the widest type. It involves the entire area network, usually using the Bullseye format. This can be used by the fighters to build situational awareness before switching to a tighter and more defined control as the intercept begins. Tactical moves focus and responsibility to the fighters, and the transmission can use either Bullseye or BRAA format. Finally, not always present is the close control. This type sees the controller in charge of the entirety of the intercept. Note that historically, this was not always possible, especially as we go back in time with our scenario, as radar refresh rate, definition, range, and so on were simply not good enough to provide such a type of very tight control. So we have mentioned two formats, Bullseye and BRAA. Let's see them in detail. The Bullseye uses a common and known position, or more than one, as a reference point. Information is therefore in relation or from the perspective of such point. Bullseye usually provide, for example, the magnetic bearing and the range from the bullseye, the altitude, and the track as the cardinal direction. BRAA is instead an acronym for bearing, range, altitude, aspect, and uses the fighter as the reference. Thus, magnetic bearing, line range, altitude, and aspect are all provided as data from the fighter to the contact. Bullseye and BRAA are sometimes interchangeable. However, keep in mind that BRAA, for a third-party fighter, so to speak, does not mean much, whereas Bullseye maintains awareness for the whole side. These three examples show how information changes depending on the reference point. Besides our aircraft labeled number 1, I have added the second one in the bottom left corner, who is minding its own business and is labeled as number 2. So the first sketch from the left shows the BRAA. The bearing is, as mentioned, the magnetic bearing from the aircraft itself. As you can immediately notice, BRAA has little to no meaning to the number 2, unless he is aware of the exact position of our aircraft. Its BRAA, for example, should be something like 0, 15, 40, etc. Next, we have Bullseye. The coordinates refer to this common point, and thus both Bullseye set of coordinates for number 1 and number 2 match. Are you starting to see the power of this method over BRAA? So using Bullseye, a potentially unlimited number of aircraft can easily coordinate direction in no time. Lastly, I've added the concepts discussed in chapter 2.1. Not all of them are used every time, of course, but this sketch shows once again how information changes depending on the point of view. The interesting part is that these three methods coexist during the intercept and engagement, and they're not redundant. You are now watching how the navgrid is displayed on the F-14 Tomcat. This tool can be used in several ways, one of which is a sort of Bullseye. However, it is nowhere near as effective, precise, or easy to use as the systems present in modern aircraft. In the F-16, for example, the value of the Bullseye changes as the cursor is moved, whereas the radar intercept officer in the Tomcat has to eyeball or heavily approximate. So, since DCS is a sandbox, controllers and comms are where we start having issues when we mix old and new. The F-14 Tomcat we have in the game at the moment, for example, does not support Bullseye, at least for the moment. So the navgrid we have seen helps, but only up to a certain point. Players and controllers must be well aware of this. As we have seen, as the year progressed and technology advanced, standards were created or updated, comms got more refined, and so on. A lot has changed since the first usage of aeroplanes in a war in 1911, more than a century ago, in the Italo-Turkish War. However, nowadays we still have differences and dialects, even within the same country. On the other hand, as long as we stick to NATO documentation, we can somewhat find a standard that works for our gaming purposes. Worst case scenario, if the situation is too complex and you are overwhelmed or just do not remember a brevity, using common language is fine. In this case, English, or what I try to pass for English. Anyway, messages are usually sent using a precise pattern. First the sender, then the recipient, then the message. Let's go through some basic terminology, starting from the macro concepts towards the finer detail. The picture is a means of establishing a common tactical air image, describing the spatial relationship of groups. A similar but different concept is the so-called leading edge picture, which includes the groups the fighter expects to target during the intercept. So zooming a little bit more, we find the concept of group. A group is a means used by higher level command and control to describe other air assets, unknown or enemy aircraft. A group is any number of contacts within 30 nautical miles in azimuth and the range of each other. The last sentence defines a key parameter, which should be discussed during or before the briefing to take into account the capabilities of each aircraft. These variables are then transformed into constants for the duration of the mission using ad hoc contacts. Finally, we turn into the minute detail, defining the keyword contract. A contract is an individual return within a group. Single contact is the assumed strength of all groups. More contacts are specified. So, for example, single group, 2 contacts. Reversing the process that we have just described, we can simplify by saying that each aircraft is a contact, one or more if close together form a group, and the arrangement of groups in the airspace dictates the picture. This is a simple example of the difference between picture and leading edge picture. The example of picture shown in the sketch contains 2 groups and introduces 2 descriptors that label and help to explain how the groups are arranged within the picture itself. As we will see later, these descriptors can be quite imaginative. Others, such as lead and trail, are quite simple. Although using fancy words may sound cool, champagne, remember that having everyone on the same page is more important. The leading edge example fundamentally pretends that only a subset of the groups in the global picture, so to speak, should be related to the fighters, and other groups are basically too far to be factors. In this example, the 2 groups are labeled north and south. What you're watching now is a set of recurring brevities. The table on the right in particular contains words used when a group is assessed against the rules of engagement. Declare is the brevity to request the identification of a specific group. Such a group can be described, for example, as hostile, which means that we are free to employ, or it can be boogie, so unknown. However, an unknown contact can be escalated and eventually engaged, depending on the internal organization of your virtual wing or squadron. So, for example, a boogie originating from an hostile space, outlaw, which does not return a friendly IFF upon interrogation, spades, and is flying high, fast, and whose radar is illuminating us, is a worthy candidate for an escalation. Although controllers see a lot, they do not see everything. A decent radar intercept officer probably sees more than an AWACS, although it takes much longer to process the information and can struggle to monitor more than a group or 2. An AWACS, in fact, has a range of a couple of 100 miles. A good RIO instead can notice a fighter-sized aircraft just by monitoring its DDD, even at a range of 120-140 nautical miles. Since the AWACS is usually placed behind the front line, this means that the F-14 can notice something that the AWACS is not yet aware of. Therefore, as I learned the hard way, if the crew has greater SA than a controller, they can take the responsibility and escalate the contact accordingly. In real life, this has actually happened. I'm referring to the second Gulf of Sidra incident, which occurred in 1989. Without going to the controversies and the mistakes that led to the kill of 2 Libyan MiG-23s, the lead RIO noticed the particularly aggressive behavior and used it to escalate and employ its weapons.
25-mile separation, turn it down.
Contacts appear to be heading 315 now, speed 430, Angels approximately 8,000.
Roger, Ace, take it north.
We have to make a quick loop here.
Starboard, I'm going to give you collision here. Okay, come starboard about 40. 207, 61 miles now, bearing 180, Angels 8, heading 330.
close out.
Come back port 20 degrees here. He's jinking now, that is. Okay, bogies appear to be coming, jinking to the right now, heading north. Speed 430, Angels 5,000 now in the descent. Okay, let's take her down now. We're going down. Turn. Slows out 53 miles now. Bogies appear to be heading directly at us. I'm coming port. Steady up 150 for 30 degree offset. 50 miles. 49 miles now. Speed 450. Angels 9. I'm going down to 3. Crossing back over. Roger. Roger that. 30 degree offset now. Bogies heading 340 speed, 500. Let's accelerate.
Okay, they look like they're at 9,000 feet now.
Roger. Bogies have jinked back into us now. Let's come starboard 30 degrees the other side. Coming starboard. Say their Angels.
Hands joined up, set station.
Roger. Angels now 11. Steady up.
Close out, warning yellow, weapons hold. I repeat, warning yellow, weapons hold. Alpha Bravo out. Roger,
Okay.
Gypsies, pass up, Bravo, directs, warning yellow, weapons hold.
35 miles here.
Roger that. Bogies have jinked back into me now for the third time. Nose is on at 35 miles. Angels 7.
Alpha Bravo, closed out, you copy?
Okay, I'm taking another offset, starboard, 210.
Guy got locked up, Leo's 30 miles and keep it 13,000 piece of trailer.
Roger that. Level off here. Okay, bogies jinked back into me for the fourth time. I'm coming back starboard. Come back port now. Port, 27 miles. Bogies at 7,000 feet.
45.
Watch that, bogies 13550, Angels 16. Heading 340.
Okay.
Roger, same bogies.
You're in collision now. Steering.
Okay, bogies have jinked back at me again for the fifth time. They're on my nose now. Inside of 20 miles. Master arm on, master arm on.
See, good light.
Good light.
Okay, centering up the T. Bogey has jinked back into me again. 16 miles, center the dot.
Say your Angels.
I'm at Angels 5, nose up.
Oh, his Angels.
Oh, wait a minute.
Angels are at 9.
Alpha Bravo from 207.
13 miles. Fox 1, Fox 1.
Oh, Jesus.
Beacon right.
Roger that. 10 miles, he's back on my nose. Fox 1 again.
Watching them up.
6 miles, 6 miles. Tally 2, tally 2. Turning into me.
Roger that. 5 miles. 4 miles.
Okay, he's got a missile off.
Breaking right.
Good hit on one.
Roger that. Good kill, good kill.
I've got the other one. Select Fox 2. Select Fox 2. I got Fox 2.
Trailer. Coming hard, stop.
So fucking shoot him. I don't got a tone.
Got the second one.
I got the second one on the nose right now.
Hey, I'm high cover on you.
Get a Fox. Lock him up. Lock him up. Hey, shoot him, Fox 2. I can't. I don't have a fucking tone. So what? Good kill, good kill.
Hey, good kill. Pilot ejected. Pilot ejected out of the second one.
Okay, Meister, let's head north. Head north.
Okay. Port side, high. I'm coming down hard.
Roger.
Roger that. Gypsies are going north. Let's go down low, on the deck. Unload, 500 knots. Let's get out of here.
Hey, 2 good shoots. We're showing 2 good shoots in the air here from Munster.
Moving on, this slide shows another bunch of brevities, some of them probably familiar to DCS players already. The table on the left shows a few brevities used to request information. The request for picture and boogie dope are straightforward. Status instead is used less often, but is a great tool to maintain awareness when sensors awareness is impaired. For example, when going out, or due to the realistic limitation of, for example, link for data link. The table on the right shows a bunch of weird words we will see in detail later. These are mostly used through different phases of an intercept and engagement. For example, the fighter session flight commits to the picture, then internally sorts the group of interest, assigning responsibility to sections or fighters using target. The other brevities refer to other phases or management of responsibility. In fact, not every time the commit leads to a missile shot. Very often, if the AI is decent, ergo heavily scripted or played by a human in a RPG sort of way, so to speak, so giving value to their virtual life, the hostile aircraft may turn cold at range, leading the section or flight to return to its task and position. The following are a series of common examples of how specific distribution of groups can be described using a single word: champagne. This is just a short set, but it should cover the most common. And that's it for this video. There is so much more that can be said about this topic, but for the purpose of the study, this should do. The next chapter, we finally move towards the timeline itself, adding a few more details that must be known before getting into the fight, and finally providing a black box overview of the procedure. Thanks for watching and take care.